Cold water encompassed Drake, sending a shock throughout his body and stealing the air from his lungs. His eyes flickered, and he felt his body failing him when his head broke the surface of the water. With new air filling his lungs, he frantically began to search for his uncle, but his cries were met with silence, and in the darkness of the abyss, his keen eyes could not avail him. Dull murmurs laced with the occasional whooping cry directed Drake's vision to the mass of shadows leering down into the vacuous void. Suddenly there was a cry from Ashe, her voice fraught with dismay. However, her pleas were cut short by contemptuous laughter, followed by jeers from the primitive mailer. With the mob's howling resounding throughout the gulf, an orange light sprang from the mouth of the pit and sped towards the waters that embraced him. For a fleeting moment, his world was illuminated and the shadows fled. Drake heard a small shriek from Ashe, which was immediately drowned out by the renewed contempt of the multitude. In the fleeting moment of light, Drake surveyed the chasm where he was trapped. Before the light was snuffed out, the boy spied what the crowd had been cheering. The boy's heart sank to his stomach when his gaze fell upon Kaysen's crumpled form, lying lifelessly atop a stony vantage just above the water's surface, several feet from where Drake struggled to stay afloat. Straining against his soaked garments, Drake's outstretched hand groped for the stone ridge. Finding a handhold, he clawed his way out of the water onto the overhang, collapsing at the feet of his uncle's limp form, shivering in the cold. Out of the water, the boy regained his wits and crawled tentatively toward his uncle, dreading what he would find. Drake's hand stretched out to rouse the old thief, and he found that though Kaysen's flesh was warm, it bore no life. Unsteadily, the urchin propped himself up against his uncle's side when the boy's hand found blood slicking the stones by his uncle's head. When hope against knowledge failed, and the truth could no longer be denied, the boy found that tears had forsaken him, and he gently embraced his uncle. Drake found himself grateful for the dreadful darkness, as he did not have the strength to endure such a sight. In silence, a torrent of grief washed over the thief, as his mind pieced together the many fractured thoughts playing out before his glossy eyes. As both their flesh grew cold in the dank, foul air, Drake came to terms with the gravity of his situation. His wet clothes sapped the heat from his body, and he felt his strength failing. In his grief, he could not bring himself to part from his uncle's side. Though his mind spurred him to action, his spirit wavered, and his heart told him all was lost. There, shivering in the dark, wishing tears would envelop him and grant some relief to his bitter spirit, Drake's courage forsook him, and into deep despair his heart sunk. A form of madness took hold in his mind, and he pawed at Kaysen's robes in a vain attempt to spur a response. But no reply answered his pleas. Soon what little energy he had left was spent, and into an uneasy sleep he slipped, as the long, cruel shadows that had haunted him up the barren summit returned to scorn the doomed soul. The echo of a single water droplet stirred Drake from his fitful slumber. The sound hung in the bleak desolation for but a moment, though it bore the weight of an eternity. His world was no longer fraught in darkness, as the pale light of the sun, concealed by overcast skies, reached the boy. Sluggishly, Drake surveyed his surroundings, unwilling to look at his uncle's broken remains. When at last he gathered up the courage to look upon Kaysen's frightful visage, he quickly turned away, tears welling up in his eyes as he took Kaysen's cloak and placed it over Kaysen's head. Drake placed his hand on his uncle's back and bowed his head. A poor memorial for a foolhardy scoundrel such as he. Had it not been for Drake's rash actions, they would have never been forced to flee. Kaysen would have greeted his end with a goblet of wine in hand, and the riches of Hydra displayed before him. Such a meaningless end for the jolly rogue. With these regrets, bitterness threatened to overtake his senses once more, and the little poise he had managed to retain would be lost. A man such as Kaysen ought to have a little wealth with him Drake bemoaned, but all he had to offer was a few copper Otmore that he had swiped from Kaysen on their journey and Drake's worn, chipped penknife. Still, he laid his meager offering at Kaysen's feet. Drake edged awkwardly back to the rock face, distancing himself from the corpse. His body cried out from the aches the fall and the numbing chill had brought as he came to rest at the water's edge. Seeking a distraction, the young thief turned his mind to the fleeting hope of escape. The walls of the chasm were straight and too smooth for a proper foothold. Even under ideal circumstances and at full strength, he doubted he would be able to scale such a vantage. His eyes glanced about, but no avenue presented itself to him, and morbid thoughts prying at his psyche made it all too easy to deem the cause lost. Clutching his knees to his chest, he peered down into the inky blackness of the placid water. The stillness was suffocating. Despair gnawed at his mind. His last comfort lay broken beside him, leaving fear and anguish a multitude of opportunities to overthrow his flagging courage. Sitting in the darkness for what seemed like an eternity, Drake felt the slightest current of warmth wisp past him, like a breath of life in this void. He began to survey the shadowy regions of the crevasse before rising to inspect every vantage. The poor light hampered his efforts, but guided by the wisps of warmth, he noticed a cleft in the rocks, just above the water on the opposite side of the ridge on which he stood. He could barely see the narrow gap in the rocks, and nothing beyond the hollow. The water between him and the outlet held Drake where he was as he contemplated the air current. He was cautious of the water, knowing well its icy depths, but this would either offer him a chance at salvation or an end to his torment. Drake drew a long, deep breath, not daring to hope. He looked back at his uncle one last time, then, taking his fate into his own hands, plunged into the icy depths. The water stung his face and numbed his body as he swam to the far side of the chasm. Upon reaching the crevasse, he found it to be long and narrow. His cold, wet hands grasped at the gap in the stone, but failed to latch on to the smooth surface. Finally, he was able to find his grip and pull himself out of the water, just above its rippling depths. Hanging from the stone face, he peered into the gap, but could find no light. He could tell the gap was not just a cavity, but was unsure how far it led. Pulling himself up into the opening, he wedged himself into the crack and wriggled into the stone wall. He could barely squeeze himself into the narrow entrance. As he crawled through the pitch black, he found himself sensing that the walls themselves were closing in on him. The tunnel was rough and jagged, scraping and scratching the boy as he blindly willed himself forward, climbing over jutting stone and weaving through the narrow passage. He came to a gap just barely large enough to squeeze his shoulders through, and here he almost turned back. The walls pressing against him from all sides, the sickly heat radiating from the rocks, and his dripping clothes added to his sense of confinement. However, Drake was able to retain his composure. His time as a thief had seen him make many harrowing infiltrations and desperate flights. With grim determination, Drake forged onward with reckless abandon, scarring his flesh with each desperate lunge. For some time, there was little hope, and his body grew weak as he strained to keep the walls from closing in around him. Exhausted, he found that there was some elbow room, and steadily the chasm began to expand. The air was slightly warmer in the small cavern, and once more, there was the faintest wisp of air, offering some much-needed hope to the wayward boy. His back bowed painfully against the unyielding stone as he blindly marched forward, stumbling over the uneven floor. As the ceiling rose, the boy's frantic pace grew, until at last, Drake was able to stand upright. With the last fleeting light of the wider world behind him, Drake could sense that the chasm that lay before him was vast. Each sound he made resounded throughout the void, with alarming volume and duration. This still world lapped up each labored breath, each waterlogged footstep like a droplet in the parched earth. Anxiously, Drake wrung his sopping clothes out. The splattering water echoed throughout the unseen world. He knew only a slow, agonizing death awaited him in the pit. But in that moment, facing the imperceivable expanse, the boy wished to flee. As he turned to face the dismal nothingness of the inky void before him, every dark shape was a baleful phantom, or monstrous form with cruel intentions. Every story of this most forbidden mountain ridge rushed to the forefront of his mind. Yet, he knew to survive, he must delve into the darkness. Steeling himself once more, Drake stepped beyond the sun's reach for the fleeting prospect of hope. The floor was irregular, and progress was slow and painful. The boy's hand glided along the wall, anchoring his position, and used it as a guide to help navigate the dangerous paths. Drake's youthful eyes quickly grew accustomed to the absence of light. He even believed that he could make out gray outlines against the jet-black expanse ahead. This development also served to prey upon his wavering heart, as each shadowy figure bore ill intent. The chasm expanded and contracted several times. He hit a plethora of dead ends, and completely lost his orientation countless times, though he was always able to find a course when he followed the warmth of the strange draft. After many hours of wandering through the chasm, with no perceivable progress to be seen, Drake steadily grew frustrated. The air currents proved to be elusive and sporadic. Following them through this maze, without the aid of his sight, was perhaps the most challenging test Drake had ever come across. Turning from side to side, he blindly searched for escape, through the many winding and ever-confounding paths. Exhausted and quite discouraged, he rested with his back to a towering stone whose peak could not be guessed. He had lost track of time, but as he sat thinking, he realized that his clothes were bone dry. He thought that he would have been battling the chill for some time without sun or wind to dry them, but perhaps he had been trapped longer than he realized. The cavern's climate was downright pleasant compared to the stone island he had left his uncle, in spite of the rot that the stone emitted, which had grown stronger since he had been down in the bowels of the mount. As calm as the chasm appeared, Drake could not overcome the feeling of suspense that had plagued him since entering. He was unnerved by the strange atmosphere that filled the chasm, and though the silence was deafening, he was grateful that the only sound he had heard since entering had been his own footsteps and their echoes. The longer he remained still, the more apprehensive he became, which ultimately cut his respite short. Being still and not having to worry that there was some unseen gulf just beneath his feet had led to Drake realizing he was quite hungry. With no rations, Drake knew he could not afford to rest, so long as he was lost in these catacombs. Many more hours passed, and Drake's green wounds began to stiffen and ache fiercely. The air had continued to warm, and now was quite comfortable for this time of year, but it was also heavy and now arduous to breathe. The scent on the air bore the same bitterness afflicting the stones and caught in his throat, yet the air stirred and was not stale. Drake soon found himself lost for breath once more, but this time it was not due to the stifling atmosphere. A faint scarlet light pulsed in the distance, high above his vantage. With renewed energy, Drake scurried toward the light, earning new bruises in his haste. Soon Drake was looking up at the reflection of the scarlet glow from off the cavern ceiling. High above him, the light source emanated from a ledge. The light offered little aid as he surveyed the best route for his ascent. As he prodded about the cliff's base, he found that it was much more coarse than the sheer stone face. If he had good light, and he wasn't so sore, he suspected he would be able to scale this hurdle with ease. As things stood, he was weakened by his fall, his bumps and bruises, as well as his empty belly. He would have to be slow and thorough. A tumble from such a height onto the unforgiving chasm floor would spell his doom. Cautiously, he began his ascent. Poking and prodding, he tested each grip, each foothold, as he inched his way to the top laboriously. Fortunately, the wall was not sheer, and there was a plethora of holds for him to move from one to the next. Upon cresting the top of the bluff, Drake saw the source of the light. Within the rock of the chasm walls ran fingers of scarlet, like veins of silver creasing the stone. There were only a few of these peculiar veins running along each of the stone walls. Rising, he followed the ridge in its gentle downward slope, till it expanded, and Drake found himself once again in a great chasm, but this time illuminated by thousands of scarlet veins running from every stone. Drake stared, astounded by the beauty surrounding him. Each of the veins gently pulsed in unison, causing shadows to dance. Drake knew somehow the scarlet was alive, and he dared not touch it, despite his curiosity. If not for the heaviness of the air, he would have been thoroughly enchanted by the alien spectacle. With the appearance of this strange flowing mineral, the thickness of the air had intensified, causing Drake to question whether he should pursue the light or turn back. However, the air current was stronger here, and in the light he found comfort, and so he decided to continue on his current course. Down into the depths of this strange mine Drake delved, no longer struggling and bumbling through the darkness. Guided by the light, he navigated the chasm. With the light, he found it easier to follow the strength of the mountain's breath. Drake soon noticed that the smaller veins of scarlet ran together into larger veins, and they all ran in the same general direction. Oddly enough, the veins' growth pointed toward the same direction the current intensified, and so, in hopes that they would lead him to something, he followed the scarlet through the chasm. The chasm began to narrow, and soon Drake found himself edging his way along a tall, tight ravine. Pressed closely to the stone, he found it impossible to avoid touching the glowing veins. To his surprise, he found them warm to the touch, and coated in a strange dampness. Another peculiarity Drake noticed was that the stone under the scarlet veins were jet black and chalky. So much so that Drake began to pry his fingertips into the stone, attempting to burrow around the veins. He just barely did not have the strength to break the rock, but if he could have gotten a better grip, he was certain it would have broken into dust. He continued to avoid the veins as much as possible, but he was much more at ease with the scarlet. Panting, Drake's gaze turned to what lay before him. From his vantage within the rift, he could see the glow of the scarlet veins in a greater chasm. Soon he was once again free to stretch his stiff limbs. The veins were much thicker here in this chasm. Some were as wide as Drake's torso. The scarlet flowed across the expanse, like strange stars in the sky, all bound and flowed together. Indeed, the veins appeared more like a great tree growing in the walls and ceiling of the boundless chasm than ore within the stones. Upon entering the great gulch, the air stung his nostrils and made the boy feel lightheaded. His breathing was labored, and his body languished from the air's oppression. He was immediately repulsed by the stodgy air. He retreated back into the ravine, gasping for breath. He stopped himself from retreating deeper, and stood, hands on knees, staggered. Drake wondered what could be causing such a visceral reaction, and questioned whether he could continue. However, the elusive caress of the faint current beckoned to him from the greater chasm. Stepping closer, Drake knew he would be remiss not to explore this chasm. The warm air had a real flow to it here. Perhaps he was very near salvation. He just needed to endure a little longer. He longed for sunlight. Though he was grateful for the ample scarlet guiding him, his eyes began to ache, and the veins stung his vision. However, in the back of his mind, he questioned if the air was the true culprit behind this affliction. Haphazardly, Drake lumbered through the cavern. Exhaustion and the weight of the air in his lungs caused him to disregard his previous caution. His body was weighty, and he could not move with any degree of agility. His footsteps rang out through the vast empty chasm. He yearned for the sound, any sound other than the monotonous clamor of his own feet. He continued to search the chasm, but it only frustrated him. In despair, he slumped down once more. Completely drained, Drake felt as though he would never rise again. as the air stifled his very breath. Drake's frayed mind recalled many things. He remembered his uncle's kind, sorrowful eyes, Ashe's face twisted in anguish, and the tragic events that had led to he and his uncle seeking refuge in Malur. He felt his eyes tearing up as he reveled in his own misfortune, and wished for the darkness to consume him. The isolation was even more suffocating than the air. Bitterly he recalled the faces of the mob, their features twisted by their own zeal in Drake's tainted recollection. His heart burned even as he recalled Ashe being restrained, as they were condemned to die. He longed for them to feel the despair that he felt in this moment. Fluctuating between rage and anguish, tears dampened his cheeks. With clenched fists, he brushed them aside angrily. He seethed as he cursed his helplessness. Choking on the air, Drake began to master his emotions. He could not let himself give in to despair. He could find a way out. There's always a way out, his uncle's voice echoed. He would not let himself die like this. With renewed resolve, Drake strengthened himself to continue, when suddenly his blood ran icy cold. The cavern reverberated with a deep rumble. A voice rang out like distant thunder, causing every stone in the chasm to quiver. Ancient, strange, slow words rolled through the dense air. Suddenly a sharp pain ripped through his mind. Tears were torn from his eyes, and his ears felt like they were bleeding. A voice like a raging inferno resounded in his mind. "I am the one they call Imris," the voice grated in Drake's mind. "Speak your name, little one." Every fiber in Drake's body burned as the hissing of the voice lingered. A whisper was all the young thief's strength could muster. "Drake." A mirthless chuckle ripped through the boy's exhausted body, bringing him to his knees as he covered his head in a vain attempt to shield himself from the assault on his mind.